On this week's NFV SDN Reality Check, we look at some of the top headlines from across the NFV and SDN space in the past week, and speak with OPNFV to get an update on its open source NFV plans and trends coming out of its recent OPNFV World event. Well, thanks for joining this week's NFV SDN Reality Check. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief at RCR Wireless News. Well, on this week's show, we have a featured interview with Heather Kirksey, who's the director of the Linux Foundation's OPNFV organization, to get an update on its work in the open source NFV market and trends coming out of its recent OPNFV World event. But first, let's take a look at some of the top headlines from across the NFV and SDN space from the past week. Well, AT&T had a busy week, first announcing the latest expansion of its SDN-based Network Functions on Demand service to 76 countries and territories. Initial services being offered include Juniper Networks virtual routing, Cisco virtual router, Fortinet's virtual security, and Riverbed virtual wide area network optimization. The Network Functions on Demand service is the third service rolled out by the carrier over its growing SDN platform, which the company said would control 70% of network functions by 2020. AT&T launched its initial Network on Demand service early last year, pushing the platform to more than 100 cities across the US, and claims more than 1,200 businesses have signed up for the solution. AT&T this week also announced a deal with European-based telecom group Orange to work on open source and standardization initiatives linked to the carrier's push towards increasing control of its network resources using SDN and NFV. The agreement calls for both operators to align on a strategic vision to move intelligence from customer hardware to the network in a move designed to trim costs and complexity. The firm said that they will work with appropriate forms for standardization discussions, which they claim can eventually lead to shorter deployment cycles and a faster pace of development. Specific areas of focus named include the creation of common specifications for premise-based devices to work in different network service providers' environments and network function software providers, work designed to streamline the onboarding process for virtual network functions, and the development of standardized APIs in support of interoperable SDN architectures. Also this week, Verizon's Enterprise Solutions Division launched its virtual network services in its latest move in furthering its SDN and NFV technology plans. The telecom operator said the Enterprise Focus platform is designed to support the migration towards a virtual infrastructure model and be available to companies worldwide through an as-a-service model. Verizon noted the service would enable enterprises to take into account various locations and staffing requirements, network service and bandwidth requirements, and support security needs, which are not possible with current hardware-based platforms. As for deployment models, Verizon said it would offer three options: a premises-based universal customer premise equipment model, a cloud-based virtual CPE services model available later this year, and a hybrid version that allows for a mix of premises-based and cloud-based deployments. The company claims support can be delivered across public, private, and wireless networks provided by Verizon, other service providers, or a combination of multiple providers across multiple networks. Initial services include security, wide area network optimization, and SD-WAN services. Partners in the program include Cisco Systems, Juniper, Fortinet, Riverbed, Palo Alto, and Viptela, with the carrier noting plans to name more vendor partners down the road. Well, definitely a lot of news coming out of the space this week. So for this week's featured interview, we spoke with Heather Kirksey, who's the director of OPNFV, to get an update on the Linux Foundation-based organization's work in the open source NFV market and trends coming out of its recent OPNFV World event. Let's take a look at the interview now. All right, thanks for joining us in this week's NFV SDN Reality Check. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief at RCR Wireless News. And this week we are joined by Heather Kirksey, who's the director at OPNFV, to talk a bit about the OPNFV space. So Heather, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Hey, you're very welcome. It's great to be here.
Very good. Well, I want to start off, maybe for those who don't know much about the OPNFV organization, maybe if you want to give a little overview, just so people might have an understanding of what you guys do.
Yeah, so we are an open source project that focuses on NFV. We are a Linux Foundation collaborative project. We've been around for about 22 months now, so we'll hit our 2-year anniversary in a couple months. And what we do is we focus on accelerating the adoption of NFV products and services. And what that ends up practically meaning is we spend a lot of time working on integration and testing and giving feedback to upstream developers who are all working on the various components that go into an NFV solutions. So whether that's OpenStack, Open vSwitch, Open Daylight, ONOS, Linux, etc. We sort of compose all these components into sort of an end-to-end platform. We do testing on them, and then we give feedback upstream, both in terms of how the sort of composed platform works, as well as features and capabilities that need to be there for telecom use cases.
Makes sense. I mean, when you said 22 months there, when you said 22, I was like, is she going to say years? I didn't think it was 22 years. But anyway, yeah. So yeah, 22 months. That makes more sense. I was nervous there for a second, but yeah, so very good.
Yeah.
It might be like 22 years for you, but I know it's like. But anyway, well, I know I want to talk a bit about. I know you guys recently had a summit in Germany, and I know we covered a little bit of the news coming out of there. But I wanted to kind of touch base with you and just kind of get your views on maybe some of the top trends that came out of there, or kind of what was the important stuff that came out of there. So maybe I guess for the organization itself, for OPNFV, what was maybe the top couple of trends or top trend that really came out for you guys from that event?
Yeah, I think there were a couple. I think the first one was the sort of cross-community collaboration. We had a number of other organizations who co-located events with us. ODL, OpenO, ONOS, ONF. I'm probably forgetting some. ODP, DPDK, FIDO. So that was a really cool thing to actually have people from these other communities who are our upstreams show up, have very useful events kind of for themselves as their own communities, but then be able to interact with the wider NFV ecosystem. And that was really exciting. And it's one of the things that we focus on. So it was good to see that happening at Summit. I think the other thing for us as an organization is just continuing maturity and growth. Some of the things we announced were our internship program, our user group program, our global meetups. We announced several new members, 3 new silvers. Lenovo is a new platinum member. So all of those were exciting things, and they're all just sort of kind of signs of advancing maturity and getting more people involved. I get really excited about things like internship programs. I really would like the telecom industry and the NFV SDN space to be a place that the next generation of technical minds is very excited to be part of. So, that's an exciting program to me. And then I think the third trend is also related to that just on the technical side. If you compare, it was only 7 months between this summit and our inaugural one. But if you just sort of look at the conversations between the two and compare them, it was still a lot of kind of figuring out what are we going to do, stuff at the last one. And this time it was, more in-depth discussions of really, how to improve our CI/CD, how to make our func test and our system testing more efficient, how to share resources amongst our testing projects. They were really sort of, meaty, detailed, getting to that next level of realization kind of conversation. So, all of those things were exciting, and it was a great event. There were just lots of people and just lots of both hallway conversations and great content. Yeah. So. Awesome.
And I think that's an important part because, going to some of these events over the past year or so, it does seem like it has evolved rather rapidly in terms of the initial ones were really just, what are we doing here? What's kind of our main purpose? And it's really moved quickly to kind of really, getting the ball rolling on actually, implementation of things and working together more closely with operators and the vendors. And it's always interesting kind of see that rapid migration or progression, I guess, of just the industry in general.
Yeah, who would have expected our industry to be moving this quickly, right? Yeah. It's actually the pace of innovation and the pace of really digging up our sleeves and figuring out things has honestly surprised me even. I'm very pleased by it, but it's actually taken me a bit by surprise. How quickly we're moving from sort of just talking high level ideas to getting things done.
Yeah, and again, it just kind of I guess plays to the fact that you have a lot of telecom operator support at these events. Yeah. Again, a lot of members are there. I know AT&T is a big part of a lot of this. A lot of the big operators are really driving a lot of this. So that seems to really be, it seems helping to kind of get everybody involved, getting the vendor community involved. I guess as you look at the event itself, how important was it to have the operators there, and also, I guess as the operators come out of that event, what are maybe some of the trends you saw for them in terms of, the big movements for the operator community coming out of the last event there?
Yeah, it's very important having the operators there. I mean, for one thing, it gets the vendors more excited if they're there. For another thing, I mean, I don't like drawing lines of vendors versus operators. I think that that's an unhealthy dichotomy, and I think actually in some ways our industry had gotten a little too much that way for a while. But because we're all trying to make this stuff happen together. But for the people who are trying to build solutions and build products, to be able to talk directly to operators and hear their needs helps them build better products and feel more secure that what they're building will actually meet industry needs. So I think that's very important. Diego Lopez from Telefonica was on the service provider panel that we had, and he actually made an interesting comment that the lines between operators and vendors are blurring. Companies like AT&T are hiring large numbers of developers. People are, folks from the operators are actually involved in the technical work of the community, actually rolling up their sleeves and leading projects and writing code and submitting blueprints. And so, and I think that that's all healthier, right? I think it creates actually a much healthier dynamic than the sort of pure outsourced R&D model that we've had for a number of years. And then in terms of trends, we heard a lot about Mano. I think Mano-related topics are definitely, I think we're beginning to see a little bit of maturity in the NFVI space a little bit, at least kind of this generation. I mean, technologies like containers are still things that that we'll be looking at that have the NFVI impact, but there was a lot of talk of Mano. We had a service provider Mano panel and a Mano track. Also, I think, beginning to really talk about operationalizing stuff, I think is another trend that we heard. And then, a lot of stuff about, sort of cloudification, disaggregation, all of that kind of stuff on sort of VNF, the functions, moving from kind of, I ported my code from my EPC and I stuck it on OpenStack to, how do we really want to architect the applications kind of going forward, and figure out how to test them out and figure out how to productively do that across the entire ecosystem. I think those are probably some of the big trends. Yeah,
it makes sense. And obviously the Mano one is an important one, because I remember I did a report, or tried to do a report last year, a little earlier last year, on Mano, and it was funny talking to people, because most people at that time were a lot of throwing their hands up in the air saying, we're not really sure, we need it, we know we need it, we don't know where it's at, we don't know where it's going. And it does seem like over the past 6 months, there's been a lot of headway in it. I mean, it seems like people are really on board with it now. There's a better understanding of it. So that's been an impressive feat just in itself, just kind of see how rapidly that's kind of come along. And it's, good to see, you guys doing a lot of focus on it as well, too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that they probably just weren't ready. I mean, you can't really start, it's just sort of ideas in a head, and it's not very tangible until you actually start, getting your hands dirty with the infrastructure layer, right? And then once you start trying to manually put some VNFs onto the infrastructure, then you start to have more of an idea of what's going to be required to, do that at scale and in an automated fashion, for real.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, again, I guess having all the carriers there as well, I mean, is there a greater sense now that the operators themselves are not just working with the vendor community more closely, but with each other? Because that seems to be still maybe a bit of a challenge, because, again, the competitive nature of telecom, we all know it's very competitive out there, but a lot of the telecom guys are all moving in this world, towards this world of virtualization. So obviously there's going to be a lot of, crossover and carryover of the technology. Does it seem like the operators themselves are getting a little more on board in terms of working together, obviously through organizations like yourselves? Yeah. I'm sure that helps, but are you seeing more progress there?
Yeah, I am. I think in a lot of ways, especially sort of in kind of, baseline infrastructure, and even if you consider sort of Mano itself as an infrastructure piece, the needs are fairly similar, right? If you think about the web world, there are lots of differentiation between like Google, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, those kinds of companies, but they're all built on, somewhat similar technical bases, right? And so if they can spend less time, kind of doing their own versions and own flavors of kind of the basic foundational stuff, then they can compete on services and bundling and pricing and innovative stuff, and they can be more agile with the types of things that they roll out. And so I think that they recognize that and they want to get some of those more basic things figured out so that they then can compete, on stuff that's more interesting and competitive differentiation and UI and apps and things like that. So, and we're actually in the process of forming an end user advisory group, which will actually give all of the end users sort of an ability for them to get together and talk with each other about their issues and then feed some of that back into the technical community. So that's sort of another place where we see them very specifically collaborating with each other, trying to figure out how best to then interact with the broader ecosystem.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point, right? I mean, just even getting into this new world of virtualization is a big move for these guys. So obviously, at some point, they'll figure out the differentiation model, I guess, and that'll be the next big thing for them to kind of figure out, to kind of get their own place in the new world, I guess. So they're working on that. Well, and I guess maybe what sort of collaboration? Because you mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of other organizations that kind of were running similar event or running events or meetings at the same event you guys are putting on. And I've been to other events this year where that seemed to happen as well, where there was, a certain main event, and then you have the smaller events kind of going on too. I guess, how was the collaboration between these different organizations? Because it does seem like, for a while there was, a new organization every week popping up, and you sort of wonder, who's doing what, and, which organization should I join? And I guess, how's the collaboration going between the various open source organizations out there?
Yeah, well, in many ways, that's kind of what OPNFV focuses on a lot of ways. Since we are focusing on the end-to-end platform, we really try to provide a framework and place for collaboration of the people that are doing various specific components within that. So to sort of ease that friction amongst them, because we are trying to take the more system level view. So it's definitely something that we focus on. But I think the collaboration is improving. I mean, there are some times when you have organizations that are definitely sort of creating competitive solutions, like there are multiple SDN controllers out there. There are, a couple different options out there for, forwarding plane and, different things for data plane acceleration. So there are going to be some that are competitive, but then there are lots of things that aren't competitive at all. They just are part of the larger ecosystem. So we're trying not to pick winners where there are competitive options, but provide an ability for people to do integration, prove out things, let the market take its course, and then also facilitate the integration and collaboration amongst, all the players out there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously with the Linux Foundation being a big part of a lot of these organizations, that seems to be kind of a nice umbrella as well. I'm guessing everybody who works through the Linux Foundation is fairly collaborative in what they're doing. You guys, probably at least see each other every once in a while, I'm guessing. So I'm sure it makes it easier to kind of work through some of the processes.
Yeah.
I'm guessing.
Yeah, no, definitely. And we have a lot of people who work cross-project as well. We have a number of people on OPNFV who work half-time on OPNFV and half-time on Open Daylight, for example. So there's both collaboration and also learning from each other. And just honestly, as an organization, being collaborative, being open, wanting to help everybody do well at their job is definitely a cultural trait that, we select for in hiring here. So.
Makes sense. Well, I guess as you guys look forward a little bit, over the next 6 to 12 months, and obviously I'm sure you have more events coming up as well. I guess what's maybe one of the big focuses, some of the big focuses for OPNFV going forward, and maybe even some of the challenges you guys might see that you want to tackle next going forward here?
Yeah. So a couple things. I think, in terms of focus area, I think we're really looking to get stronger in security. Okay. We did a survey of operators, and security came out as the number one area they want us to focus on. Yeah. So that's definitely a thing. I think continuing, as some of the other upstream nano projects, mature, I think that we'll want to work on integration with them. Mm-hmm. And then just sort of the continuing improvement in maturity kind of across the things that we do. We've been putting a lot of attention on infrastructure recently, and that will continue. So those are our projects like our Ferris test labs, our CI/CD, our testing projects, as well as our Genesis project, which is sort of our umbrella project for a lot of our different controllers and requirements on, install tools. And so, just really sort of getting all of that tightened up so that our releases go more smoothly. We've got our upcoming Colorado release, which is expected towards the end of September. So, just really, in terms of enabling us to grow, getting those foundational infrastructure pieces are some of the most some of the most important bits that we need to do.
Yeah, it makes sense. I guess, is there an issue at all, I guess, in terms of the standards part of this as well? I mean, I know ETSI's been working pretty hard on trying to standardize a lot of this stuff here. Obviously, the open source community, it's kind of not it's a challenger, because open source tends to kind of not necessarily go against a standard per se, but it is maybe a different way to look at things. I guess, how is that process moving along, and how are you guys, I guess, working through, I guess, the standards issue, if that's the right one?
Yeah. So, I mean, my background is actually, I was a standards wonk for a number of years at Alcatel. So I'm very familiar with that world. And I take a fairly pragmatic view towards all of it, which is that I think that the sort of standards making philosophy will change because of the rise of open source, but it doesn't mean that standards are no longer necessary or useful, but does perhaps change which standards are the most useful. We have a great working relationship with ETSI, for example. I've also been going to the IETF about every other meeting for about the past year and a half. And our yardstick project, which is our system level testing project, directly comes out of the ETSI TST1 spec. We've been talking to ETSI about how to potentially collaborate in the future on things like PlugFests. I think that, one of the things that standards professionals tend to be very good at are things like PlugFest. They're things like testing specifications. They're things like characterizing testing methodology that, and then the open source community is very good at implementation and writing things and doing that sort of stuff. So I think, to the extent that we can do like we did with Yardstick, which is actually write the testing framework described in a testing document, automate it, get it into the CI/CD pipeline, get it in line with every single build that we do of OPNFV scenarios, that becomes a very, useful way. I mean, we all want to move the industry forward, and, we just need to figure out the right way to do it.
Yeah, and obviously, I think, like you said earlier, you had Diego Lopez at your event, and he's obviously works at ETSI as well as Telefonica. And so, again, having him there, I guess it kind of shows that even, those guys are definitely on board in terms of the open source community as well.
Yeah. And certainly Telefonica just, recently was part of launching OSM, which is, another open source organization focused on Mano. So, I think, I think it's a general industry thing. Once again, I'm not a sort of, standards versus open source person, but I think that we realized the existing way that we thought of standards and then pushing them off to R&D community and then coming back a few years later and then doing interop testing, it was just not working. So just all of us, whether we're focused on open source pieces or standards pieces or hardware or software or cloud or SDN or NFV, we all have a part to play to move ourselves forward. And if we're not thinking of it that way, then we might want to, have a little bit of an attitude reset.
Well said. It's a whole new world out there. So that's part of it. I guess I want to touch base. Obviously, like you said, I guess the next release coming out for you guys is Colorado. You said, I know Brahmaputra came out earlier this year, correct?
Yep. Yeah, March 1st, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. And that I'm guessing that obviously it's always a learning experience, but that pretty well receptive in the audience out there for everybody, I'm guessing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are a couple of different things that we do with our releases. I mean, one is, it's a point in time where we release some bits that we've, done some specific work and testing on. The other thing is what we learn and prove out and take upstream, and how we're also able to improve kind of our DevOps methodology. So, coming out of, Brahmaputra, we were able to, have a lot of learnings that we took, especially around things like, SDN-based VPNs and service function chaining that we've been, sort of really collaborating with taking that upstream. And so, we'll have improvements in our upstream components as well, when we get to the Colorado timeframe. So, there's we're interesting as a project because, we do own some of our own code, but the majority of the code that comes out in our quote unquote releases is owned by other organizations and developed by other organizations. So, it makes our release process a little bit different. Yeah. It's more on what do we learn from the integration? What can we get to work via integration? And what do we learn in our system level testing of new features that's important, to take back to other places. So, people tend to lean one end or the other, that they find the bits more interesting, or they find the upstream influence and testing, piece more interesting, kind of depending on sort of where they, their interests lie. But, we kind of focus on sort of both of those as we're trying to, do the release.
Yeah, you guys gotta be neutral in the whole process as much as you can. I'm sure that's part of the challenge for you guys as well. And obviously, and obviously with the new release too, I like it only because it'll be easier for me to spell. I won't be misspelling it all the time. I appreciate that, at least just myself there, but that'll be nice when that comes out. But well, hey, great. I definitely appreciate the good insight on this. Obviously, a lot going on there at OPNFV, and it sounds like it was a great event. A little too far for me to go to reach it, but hopefully the next event, if it's a little closer to me, I'll be make sure I attend it. But again, thanks so much for the time and insight today. We definitely appreciate it. Well, thanks for watching this week's show, and make sure to check us out again next week when we are scheduled to speak with Jeff Gray, who's the CEO of Glue Networks, to discuss how carriers can boost automation and reliability by simplifying network deployments.
NFV SDN Reality Check with Dan Meyer is a production of RCR TV. To suggest show topics or to reach Dan, you can find him on email, dmeyer@rcrwireless.com, and on Twitter @Meyer_Dan. For more Dan, news on NFV SDN and everything wireless, find your way over to rcrwireless.com.